Now the first two foundations are done, body and feeling. So we are coming to mind, third foundation. In Pali, Kaya-nupassana is mindfulness of the body, Vedana-nupassana, mindfulness of feeling, and this is Chitta-nupassana. And Chitta consists of all aspects of mind. So we'll read this first and see what the sutta says. And how does a bhikkhu abide contemplating mind as mind? Here a bhikkhu understands mind affected by lust as affected by lust, and mind unaffected by lust as unaffected by lust. He understands mind affected by hate as affected by hate, and mind unaffected by hate as unaffected by hate. The word lust, it can be substituted for the word greed. Sometimes it's translated as lust, sometimes as greed. It's greed, hate, and delusion are our three roots of evil, which are very much based within. So these are mentioned here. Third one is he understands mind affected by delusion as affected by delusion, and mind unaffected by delusion as unaffected by delusion. I'll talk about those three first. Delusion has a particular meaning in the Buddhist terminology, and that meaning is the delusion of self, the misunderstanding that we think we are an entity called me, which has an inner core and a substance from which all this me arises. That's called delusion in Buddhist terminology. And it is the generator of greed and hate. So to see oneself with a mind affected by delusion is certainly not easy, because unless we are enlightened, our mind is always affected by delusion. So we wouldn't know the difference. So this presupposes, this particular statement presupposes that we have already come to states of non-delusion. Now the opposite in terminology would be wisdom or insight, either panya or vipassana, so that we would know the difference. In other words, we would be aware of the fact that we have been able to go along without any self-concept for even the shortest period of time, so that we become aware of such fact when it does arise again. However, for an ordinary, everyday kind of person, that would not exist, that type of knowing, because they haven't come to that non-self-concept yet. If we have, we would know the difference. We would realize how it feels to be without self and how it feels with self. And obviously, an Arahant never has that self-concept, so he never has a mind affected by delusion, but he would also never have a mind affected by lust or greed or by hate, because those two are the effects of that particular cause. Now, when we realize that our mind is affected by greed and our mind is affected by hate, we would be able to realize that the mind is reaching for something. It's either reaching out to resist and reject, which comes under the heading of hate, and it doesn't have to be violent hate. Hate is the overall description of all that which we don't like. And that can even be the weather. Very mild, naturally, very mild hate, but still under that heading. So we are reaching out to get rid of, in other words, trying to push it away. And if it is lust or greed, it is a mind that wants to accumulate, it's trying to possess, trying to get. So we don't even need our labeling process just yet here if we are mindful enough to realize when the mind is doing one of those two things, pushing or pulling. That which gives one a feeling in the mind of disquiet, naturally. Hate and greed are never quiet, never peaceful. It's a feeling of disquiet, and it's certainly a feeling of being at not at ease, of wanting something. And the first noble truth that the Buddha proclaimed, and the second one, the first one is that there is dukkha, and the second one that it only has one cause, and that's wanting, craving. So we could actually put these two together and say that we're aware of a mind that has dukkha, because both of these are generating dukkha. Are you aware now what dukkha means, Stephen? Yeah, okay. It just occurred to me that you wouldn't have heard it before, except here. Yes. So, although our labeling in the meditation process will help us tremendously to realize that when this is happening in daily life, because we become acquainted with this aspect of ourselves where we actually give a name to what we're doing in the mind, we don't have to come this far when we watch mind. We can stay with the disquiet, with the mind which is not at ease, with the mind which is either trying to push or to pull. And we don't even have to come to the point of saying, aha, hate, greed, but we can say, we can see it as dukkha. That's also enough. And when we see that dukkha, we may have enough sense to realize that we do not have to produce our own dukkha. However, the labeling will help us also to realize that the dukkha has a cause. And it's always the same cause, wanting something, either wanting to get it or wanting to get rid of it, which is either greed or hate. So when we become very mindful of our own mind states, which the labeling process in the meditation is supposed to help us to do, this can be extremely worthwhile in daily life to be able to let go of that. Greed, hate, and delusion. With the delusion state, we can use this word delusion in not its ultimate sense, the ultimate sense which I've already explained just now, but we could use the word delusion in a sense of more everyday life, where we see ourselves all of a sudden misinterpreting, reacting to something which is in our own mind, but projecting it outward. Now, all that is delusion, obviously. So, while the ultimate sense is definitely delusion of self, always in the terminology, this particular aspect of mind is also very important to be able to notice. We are projecting outward instead of staying with the things that they really are. We are imagining, we are fantasizing. All these are deluded states. Mainly misinterpreting, which is a very common mistake that all of us make. Misinterpreting other people's intentions, misinterpreting states of being in ourselves and others, and so forth. And that misinterpretation is, of course, caused by that basic delusion of self. Because the Buddha said that all our viewpoints and all our opinions are wrong because all of them are colored by this self-delusion. But since it is very difficult for us to see that self-delusion, as a factor in our daily living, where it colors what we're doing, it is a step on the way to become aware of interpretations and projections. Sure.
About the delusion of self, what would you say to women, who don't have a sense of self, of a healthy sort of sense of self? Okay, they're not, au fait with it from this ultimate point of view at all, but that cripples them.
Yes. It's more probably a sense of inferiority. And that sense of inferiority is unfortunately just as much a sense of self as a sense of superiority. They're both equally deluded. And in sense of inferiority needs to be balanced back to a sense of on the middle by showing people certain abilities that they didn't pay attention to that they have, or certain good things about themselves which they didn't think about, so that they can get a little more in the balanced state. Whereas a person who has a sense of superiority, of course, is very hard to deal with, and not so easy to show them that they're just the same like everybody else. With people who have an inferiority complex, it's a little easier to show them good things about themselves. Both are deluded states of self. Either I'm not as good as, or I'm better than. And both are the same thing. And people who have that, the inferiority one, of course they find it difficult to practice because they start out with the idea of, well, I'm not good enough to practice, or I'm, not capable of that type of thing.
Yes, and psychologists have, or ones that I've been dealing with, they have this attitude that if people don't have this sense of self, they're not ready for meditation. And I don't feel that myself, but I can't get through to them what I do feel about it, because I think that people would be helped tremendously.
Well, it depends, how strongly they're affected detrimentally by this particular difficulty. If they're very strongly affected, they do need probably, I'm just guessing, a bit of therapy first. If it's just the ordinary kind of inferiority complex, which we all suffer from here and there, then and now, not always, but sometimes, and if they have it a little more exaggerated, certainly the practice of the Dhamma would help them. I think it depends on the strength of the difficulty. If the difficulty is very strong, maybe they do need that, something else first. Where were we? Contracted. Oh, yes. Okay. Anything else about hate, greed, and delusion? Any question, or any comment on anything? Other than that we wish we didn't have it or something. Yes.
What would you recommend if a deluded state of mind arises, it's mental formation, and one has found by experience it's probably the one and same delusion day in and day out, just to immediately label it, my such and such, and you can drop it.
Mm-hmm.
Don't go into it anymore.
Yes. The more often you drop it, the easier it stays away. The mind has that habitual way of coping with things. If you allow it to become quite open and spread itself around this particular delusion, then it makes itself at home and doesn't really want to go away. So the quicker one drops it, the better.
I don't bother to investigate it.
No. Unless you can't get rid of it.
Oh, I'm fed up, I'm bored to tears. I'm trying to get rid of it.
Yeah, but if it has such strength that even when you tell it go away.
Oh yes, if I just label it as my particular need.
It does. Okay, fine. He understands contracted mind as contracted, distracted mind as distracted. Now the translator himself talked about contracted mind as lethargy, a lazy mind. But it's not always understood as such. Contracted mind is very often understood as selfish mind, because it contracts to only this one person. It has no interest in anything which is either outside others or universal. It is contracted to self. And it actually, when one becomes rather attentive to these mind states, one can feel it as being very narrow. We say narrow-minded, well, that's a contracted mind, narrow-minded. Somebody who stays along certain ways of thinking and you can't shift them. And that narrow-mindedness is usually based also on personal wishes and personal opinions. So contraction is not always lethargy. It is that too, naturally. It is a mind which is tired and doesn't want to exert itself, so it contracts. It becomes unable to be smooth and expansive and generous. But it is also the selfish mind. It's also contracted mind. And we can feel it in us. Experiences, by the way, no matter where they come from, are only experiences when we feel them. Everything that we really experience is something that we can feel inside. And our way towards wisdom is the understood experience. And the understanding is helped by knowing the Buddha's words, but the experience we have to have ourselves. So this is the contrary. With distracted mind, everybody knows forward and backward and sideways. Huh? It's an old friend. We know it. He understands exalted mind as exalted. Now here the translator, N stands for the translator, that's Jnanamoli, English monk, long dead, describes exalted as a state of the jhana, as one of the meditative absorption states. And one can, of course, describe it as such. But it can also be a mind which is fully and totally imbued with loving kindness and compassion. And a loving kindness and compassion which is totally outgoing, does not have any particular person in mind or in focus, but is just so generous and expansive and pliable that it just has only that state in it, loving kindness and compassion, either one or both. It also can be called an exalted state of mind. So obviously we know when we get into the meditative absorptions that we change our state of consciousness, and also we know that when we feel love and compassion that we have a state of mind which is somewhat, shall I say, above the usual state where we are concerned with our own benefits, because that is no longer concerned with one's own benefits. One is concerned with giving. Loving kindness, compassion is giving out. So that too can be called an exalted state of mind. Well, obviously, the mindfulness of one's mind states has all these and all its connotations of these states within. Right? So we have greed, hate, and delusion. We have contraction and distraction. We have exalted and unexalted. No, not exalted. Is that English? Unexalted? Unexalted. Oh, well, all right. Well, a state of mind which is ordinary, which I usually call the marketplace kind of mind, where we have the total dichotomy in the mind. The dichotomy of this is yours and this is mine, this is what I want and this is what I don't want, this was yesterday, this is going to be tomorrow, I like it, I don't like it, it's good, it's bad, and so on. It's that constant duality, which is the ordinary state of mind, the everyday kind of state of mind which we use in our business dealings. We can't do any other way, because there's no other way to do business dealings. And it's interesting to know that people who do know other states of mind then often, to their own detriment, try to use those other states of mind in business dealings. It's impossible. It just can't be done, because business is the marketplace and it needs a marketplace kind of mind. And the only thing to do is, when one's mind has gone beyond those kinds of things, is to leave the marketplace and not go back there. So, yes?
I was just wondering about the extremes of those states, like manic depression.
I don't think the Buddha ever dealt with that kind of thing. It's never mentioned. It never dealt with states of mind which are not what we call normal. I mean, the Buddha said we're all not normal, all of us, because we're totally deluded, so we can't be normal. But what we call normal, he only dealt with that kind of mind. He never dealt with things that were not. Because, you see, when a person is no longer on that level that we are on, which is, low enough as it is, how do we communicate? And the Buddha communicated on that kind of with words, on two levels. However, he also communicated without words, of course, with people who were what we call mad. But that was his own personal ability. So they got out of their mad states, and then he was able to teach them. But with exalted and unexalted states of mind, that's exactly the kind of things that we get without having, any aberrations in the mind. The next one is the surpassed mind and the unsurpassed. Now the translator again, presumably calls the surpassed state the state of jhana, yes. In realization also. The word surpassed here is meant by the translator to denote either a state of mind in the meditative absorptions again, in the jhanas, or in one of the states of liberation, nibbanic state. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. However, if we want to use this in our daily living as something useful to watch our own mind, we can again presume to that word surpass to mean also surpassing the dichotomy, surpassing our own selfishness and ego-centeredness, and becoming universally attentive. In other words, when we look, for instance, at some dukkha that's happening to us, and we're getting all upset about it, and we're getting worried about it, and maybe we're even getting self-pity about it for ourselves, or we're trying to run away from it, or whatever it is. If we then, this is obviously a very unexalted state of mind. It also has very unexalted results, namely unhappiness. However, if we then look at the Buddha's teaching and say, the Buddha said dukkha is everywhere. Existence is dukkha. And it's only because I want something. And that too is a universal problem. And he also said if I dropped the wanting, I could drop the dukkha. And if I did that, I would be following the Buddha's teaching, well, I'm obviously surpassing the ordinary state of mind. So by going back to the teaching and seeing the universality which applies to everyone, we are surpassing our daily and ordinary states of mind, which are constantly putting us back into unhappiness and dissatisfaction. So that too could be construed to mean surpassing that which is ordinary. Okay, is that clear? Any questions on that? And next one is the concentrated mind and the unconcentrated mind. Well, I think that's no big deal. Huh? Everybody knows how to know when they're concentrated and when they're not concentrated. However, if we're talking about meditation here, if we are concentrated and then say to ourselves, boy, am I concentrated today? Well, that's the end of that, isn't it? That's the end of the concentration. So it would be better to do that in retrospect, to realize that I had a concentrated state of mind, and that's why I was able to have a change of consciousness or an experience which was insightful or whatever it was. If it applies to our daily living, it's interesting because we can, in daily living at times, also become very much aware of the fact that we're totally unconcentrated. I think everybody's had the experience of reading a book, a page of a book, coming to the bottom and not having a clue what it said. Realizing totally unconcentrated mind. Mind went all over the place instead of paying attention to what I was reading. So then, making a determination, I'm going to be concentrated, putting the attention back on that page and actually knowing what it says. So these things do apply to both, to our meditative states, as the translator says, to the jhanas, the meditative absorptions, but it also applies to our states of mind in daily living. And mindfulness is, of course, a state of mind which is sharpened in the meditation, which is trained in the meditation. But it needs to be continued in daily living, and it becomes so habitual in daily living, you can't actually do anything except that, particularly watching one's mind state. Even if one doesn't pay any attention to how the feet are going down the steps, if the mind is playing tricks at that time, to know the mind states is the way to reduce or eliminate all unhappy states. Because then, as long as we know what the mind is doing, we can choose whether we want to keep it going like that or do something else with the mind. So our mind states are really extremely important. And then he knows a liberated mind is liberated and unliberated mind is unliberated. Now here we have to really say, he doesn't give any footnotes for it, that this refers to the reviewing knowledge. The reviewing knowledge is a step which is done after what is called path and fruit. Now I'm using very much terminology of the Buddhist terminology. The path moment is the moment when a person has either the first, second, third, or fourth time the experience of nirvana. That's called path moment. The fruit moment is following that, the realization of what has been achieved. And reviewing knowledge is the review of the defilements which are still there and which have been eliminated. So here, when we talk about liberated mind and unliberated mind, we would, at this point in time, know ourselves to be unliberated. However, when it comes to path and fruit, the mind would then know that there has been a moment of liberation but that there are still things to be done. So this is what this also refers to, again, the meditative states. In our own daily attention to the mind, if we know ourselves to be unliberated, we would always be on guard that we don't make bad karma. That would be our attempt at watching an unliberated mind. See, an unliberated mind is a mind that is imbued with self. So every ordinary person has it. That's not a value system that everybody's got it. However, the only thing to do with that unliberated mind is to be able to see that making good karma will help it to purify itself. That purification system which leads it then towards liberation. Good karma is liberation. Good karma is purifying, sorry. The meditation itself is also purifying. Every single moment of concentration is one moment of purification, because we can't have any negative thoughts and negative reactions at the time of concentration. So the unliberated and the liberated mind concerns particularly the reviewing knowledge after the past or improved moment. But we can use it as
a specific science of purification.
Yes, that is probably the one we had in the last course, no? In the 10-day course? Yes. So we are here concerned with our mindfulness on mind states. And while our labeling system does help us in the meditation to do that, it has to become habitual in daily living also. The labeling. Because then we become the choosers rather than the victims. And in this way he abides contemplating mind as mind in himself, or he abides contemplating mind as mind externally, or he abides contemplating mind as mind in himself and externally. So the footnote says that's only by inference for reflection, or by using the knowledge of others' minds if he possesses it. Well, using the knowledge of others' minds is a very dicey thing to do, because most minds are rather unpurified. So it's not such a wonderful thing to do. But contemplating one's own mind in oneself and contemplating mind externally, I have to admit that I interpret it entirely different. Not looking at other people's minds. I mean, this is a parlor game which is really not useful for most people anyway. When we, for instance, hear a sound or see a sight, which is something which is happening externally, because the sound is external to us and the sight is external to us, and our ear and eye are connecting through the ear or eye consciousness, which means hearing or seeing results. From that, we can see how thinking arises, which is then the reaction to that. Now, obviously, that's within ourselves, but it is caused by outside triggers. And to see the outside triggers, how they cause us then to react, is also an aspect of mindfulness which will give us a great deal of insight into ourselves. And here in this environment, very useful to do, nothing disturbing here very much. You hear a bird sound, and first of all, if you're outside, you will try and see the bird. That's the first thing. What was that? Oh, which one? Oh yeah, maybe that one there. And then the mind will look at, then the eye will look at the bird, and you've had not only the sound then, but also the sight of it, And then the mind will start telling stories about the bird. So it is very interesting to become acquainted with one's way of being totally dependent upon sense contacts. Now, obviously, we don't have to deny sense contacts, but we have to learn not to be dependent on them and not to react instinctively, but by choice.
One thing I discovered today was when I was doing that, almost immediately after I could, oh, okay, it's a bird. It was like I watched my mind kind of catalog and it kind of spit out the other times I've seen a bird. You know, like there's always seems to be a memory that wants to come up.
Yes.
And this I know because I've done a lot of sense memory exercises because I've done acting. So we would do this a lot, so I know that happens. But what I noticed then was that a lot of times there'll be a mind state attached to it. And it's such a subtle thing, it's like it happens without almost even knowing it, and then suddenly you're in this mind state.
Because of that memory that has come back.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it was really...
It happens very often with smell also.
Yeah.
You smell something, all of a sudden you're back in Calcutta.
Hopefully it was probably not.
Yes, well, this is where mindfulness, this absolute and utter mindfulness, rescues you from all that. See, now utter mindfulness would be that the sound remains a sound. And that's all. Now that's a very interesting way of practice. The sound is just a sound. It's no longer bird. It's no longer where does it come from. It's no longer I've heard that sound before and that must have been a similar bird. And although I wasn't here then, maybe they have those birds also somewhere else and all the rest of it. But just sound only. And the same, of course, goes for sight. With sight, even more difficult. Because with sight, what the eye can see is only shape and color. That's all the eye can see. The rest is all mind. The minute the mind says leaf, it's mind. It's not the eye. The eye can't see a leaf. The eye can see green and the shape of it. That's all. Now that's very, very difficult to stop the mind from responding. And all that is based on memory, because we were told that it's a leaf. We were told when we were very small, this is a leaf. Because we used to also say, what is that? And so it's a leaf. So now the mind says, a leaf. And then of course the mind says, quite pretty actually. Does it smell? Oh no, it doesn't smell at all. Oh, these Australian natives don't smell, do they? I wonder if that's an Australian native. I haven't seen that. I mean, you're often running for the next half hour, you know. So with the sound, it's even a little easier. With the sight, it's very difficult. But it's well worth an experiment. And when you have made the experiment and have actually been able to stop the mind at some point or other, you will see that peacefulness is guaranteed. The lack of peacefulness comes from our reactions to our sense contact. You try it out and see. So I have to interpret it externally in that manner, because I do not like to pay attention to the fact that, of course, it is possible to, also know what other people are thinking, but then also you have that possibility of misinterpretation and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Mm.
Can I just ask a question on this contemplating mind externally and contemplating mind internally? There with the optical, just the seeing, and seeing images without labeling, without differentiating or anything. When I read that passage, that's what came to mind. That was the real meaning.
Mm-hmm.
seeing the mind externally.
Mm.
And seeing that the image is actually being seen by the mind and not by my mind. If it's by my mind, then I'm back on the internal thing again, all the labelling stuff. But if an exercise is given to contemplate the images that are seen, are actually seen by mind and not labelling it as my mind, then that's like seeing external mind.
You got yourself into a complete bind there, because the mind doesn't see a thing. The eye sees, the mind interprets. The mind is constantly interpreting. So when I use them, as I say, I'm using the word externally for this process of the eye. I mean, you have to have eyes, right? Seeing an object, whichever it may be, and immediately realizing then, watching this process, that the mind is interpreting. What comes first is a feeling. We very often don't notice it because it's neutral. You see, if you see a green leaf, I mean, the feeling that arises from that is neutral. You know, you don't have any great desire for this green leaf, nor do you have any great resistance or hate for it. So it's a neutral feeling. The next thing which arises is very noticeable. It's a perception. It says leaf. Naming. Perception is naming. So we don't have any problem knowing that. That's what we're doing. And then the mind reacting, saying, oh, well, this is not interesting. Or telling a whole story about leaves.
So what he's seeing then, if the eye, the eye, EYE, is not the thing that's actually doing the seeing.
No, it's the eye consciousness that's doing the seeing. I think we'll get to that in a minute. That comes a little later. But it's the eye consciousness, the EYE consciousness, that is doing the seeing, yes. But it's a mind which is doing the knowing. You see, I always explain it this way. If I show you this, you know it's a clock. I have no problem knowing that this is a clock, right? But if I give this to a 2-year-old, he has a great deal of difficulty knowing that this is a clock. In fact, he probably thinks it's a building block. And he's going to try and build a little house if he can find something else to stick it on. He may think it's a ball and start throwing it around. Okay? So, that he sees the same thing you're seeing doesn't mean yet that his mind is interpreting it in the same way. The 2-year-old's mind hasn't got the memory of clock.
What's common is the seeing, though.
That's common, but the interpreting isn't. Yeah. And the seeing is only shape and color.
So it's not the mind that sees.
No. The eye that sees and the mind that interprets. And this is a very interesting exercise, particularly, first of all, knowing, you see, the Buddha always advocated this analysis, to see how these things fit together, how we are not one complete mass and one whole, but how this all happens in sequence, because it also diminishes our I-me delusion somewhat when we see how it happens in sequence. Okay, so that's mind externally the way I'm using it, and I find that a good practice and exercise to do, to get a little more knowledge about oneself, how this happens.
Yes. After that mental formation or the reaction to the leaf, I like it or I don't like it, then how does sense consciousness then happen?
That's the first thing that happened. That was the sense contact, the seeing.
Oh, that's the first one.
Yes. First comes the seeing itself.
Before the feeling.
That's right. Or else he abides contemplating in the mind its arising factors, or he abides contemplating in the mind its vanishing factors, or contemplating both arising and vanishing, which again brings us back to impermanence, how all our mind states come and go. Now, again, this makes us an objective observer of mind states. As long as we are an objective observer of our mind states, we do not have to be the experiencer of it. In other words, if there is dukkha in the mind, if there is any kind of unhappiness, any worry, any fear, any anxiety, and we are observing that, being the observer takes us out of being the anxiety person. So that brings us to the, helps us to have equanimity, and also the observation of the arising and ceasing shows us that it ceases right then and there. Otherwise we can't observe the ceasing. It ceases right then and there. The whole thing falls apart because we are an objective observer. To be an objective observer of one's own mind is, of course, not as easy as it sounds. It's very simply explained. And why isn't it easy? Because we think it's our own mind. We own it. And that's why we suffer. Mindfulness will take us out of that. The objective observation of mind states will show us that we don't own it. It is just arising and ceasing. If we were to own it, we certainly never make it a being unhappy, would we? Foolish, wouldn't it? And then, of course, there's the other possibility, as the same as there was with body and feeling, or else mindfulness that there is a mind is simply established in him to the extent of bare knowledge and remembrance of it, while he abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. This is how a bhikkhu abides, contemplating the mind as mind. Abiding independent means that we do not react to the states, either states of mind or to the outer triggers which happen to us. Now, objective. If we are objectively watching, then we can be independent. And abiding independent has connotation of meditation also, because the calm meditation, the meditative absorptions, make us independent of worldly pleasures and also worldly pains, because we're able to let the mind rest without the thinking process. But it also has the connotation of knowing there is a mind which is arising and ceasing with its mind states, but we do not get involved in it. We don't own it, we do not identify. It's the identification process which brings us to the me delusion. We are identifying with mind, feeling, body, and so on. We're also identifying with other things. We're identifying with either being male or female, young or old, pretty or ugly, stupid or intelligent, rich or poor, and all the things in between. The more identifications we can find, the more of an ego support we have. And as we will find out when we read about the five aggregates, these mind and feeling particularly are the identification processes which bring us to this is me. I'm thinking that. It's not you thinking that, so it's me thinking that, so it must be me. And yet, it arises and ceases. It never remains. So where's the me when the mind state has ceased? Has that also ceased? It's a very important investigation. But the first step is to realize that that is where the me arises from that ownership of mind and feeling. And once we have seen that that's where it arises from, we can also see the absurdity of it very soon. Any question from that? We've had those 3 steps earlier with the other mindfulness steps. First is the mindfulness, of knowing in oneself what is arising, then is the impermanence, the arising and ceasing, and then is that there is such a thing as mind or as feeling or as body. So three. So the fourth foundation of mindfulness is Dhammanupassana. Now the word Dhamma, as I think I have mentioned before, is a word which is often used in different meanings. When it's spelled with a small d, it means phenomena or factors. Now here in this sutta, as it's well known by everyone who's ever read this sutta, the Dhammas, the factors, are particularly described. They're described as the 5 hindrances, the 5 aggregates, the 6 bases, the 7 enlightenment factors, the 4 noble truths, as the factors which can arise in the mind. Now, obviously, in order to notice that, one has to know those things by heart. One has to know the 5 hindrances, the 5 aggregates, the 7 enlightenment factors, the 6 bases, and the 4 noble truths all by heart. In other words, one cannot possibly know which one of those dhammas is arising, right? Well, very few people do in this day and age. Maybe in the time of the Buddha they all knew it by heart. Today it's usually only the teachers that know this thing by heart because they've got to. So, so what do we do about this? The Dhammanupassana is content of mind. Okay? So the former one, the one before this, the mind states, right, are the states of mind. Greed, hate, delusion, contraction, distraction, exalted, surpassed, ordinary, concentrated, unconcentrated, states of mind, right? Now comes content of mind. And content of mind is very much concerned with the labeling process. And this is why I keep saying, all right, if the mind state, if you're in your meditation, your mind is being distracted and it has impact, in other words, it stays distracted for some time, not just a fleeting like a cloud, but it is a bit of an impact there. Label. Because that's the only way you'll ever know what is Dhammanupassana, what is the content of mind in daily living. Now, I don't expect people to know these things by heart. If they do, that's great. I'm very happy if people know these things by heart. But labeling will give one the possibility to know whether there has arisen a state of agitation and the content of agitation, of fear, whether there is a content in the mind of grasping and clinging and craving, or whether there's a content in the mind of giving, of mindfulness, of being generous, of lovingness. Those things one does know through the labeling process. Now, as the labeling process in the meditation has been well established, and again, don't use it if the mind is concentrated. Please don't interrupt the concentration. But if it isn't concentrated, use it. Then it is very easy to do that in daily living. And as we see ourselves in daily living having a mind which is full of dislike, rejection, worry, we'll know very soon that that is not a good state to continue. And we'll learn to substitute. And this is the thing that we learn in the meditation. By labeling and knowing the state that the mind has, the content, we substitute with the breath. In daily living, we substitute the unwholesome with the wholesome. That clear? Quite clear? No problem. Yes.
The Buddha is saying there that all the content of mind can be analysed under all those headings.
Yes. Particularly, yes, particularly those headings, yes. That's quite so. But again, people don't know those things, yes. Yes, yes, the factor of the mind, yes. What the mind is doing, yes. I'm using the word content because it makes it clearer. But many factors come together, yes. Yes, it is content. Yes, yes, you can. You can have an unconcentrated state of mind and no particular content in it. It's just woozy. It's, foggy. But it doesn't have any particular content in it. Just the mind state of fogginess. But these are contents, actual content in the mind. Actually something you can say actually more solid than just the mind state. Something you really can put your finger on. Particularly having practiced the labeling in the meditation, you can really put your finger on, here I am now really lusting after some sensual pleasure. I want to get something nice to eat. Well, that's a content. That's a really solid content. That's one can do. So we have I'll just read this out because we won't have enough time to talk about the 5 hindrances. See, the 5 hindrances are a very important aspect of the teaching. They are a consolidation of the difficulties which beset us under 5 headings. You can probably make some subtitles also. We're going to make several subtitles for it. But these 5 headings are a consolidation of the difficulties. I'll just read that. Here a bhikkhu abides contemplating Dhammas as Dhammas in terms of the 5 hindrances. The translator means they're not obstacles, they're more hedges. Well, what's the difference between a hedge and an obstacle? An obstacle is something you've got to jump over, and a hedge you've got to cut down. I don't quite see the essential difference in it. That block the way. Hedges that keep you. Yes, I see what he's talking about. They keep you in the traffic stream of lust, hate, and delusion, and they're not an obstacle that blocks the way. Well, they're both, of course. How does a bhikkhu abide contemplating Dhammas as Dhammas in terms of the 5 hindrances? Here, there being desire for sensual pleasures in him, a bhikkhu understands there is desire for sensual pleasure in me, or there being no desire for sensual pleasures in him, he understands there's no desire for sensual pleasure in me. And also he understands how there comes to be the arising of the unarisen desire for sensual pleasures, and he understands how there comes to be the abandoning of arisen desire for sensual pleasures. And he understands how there comes to be the future non-arising of abandoned desire for sensual pleasures. I thought English was a really easy language. It's a little difficult, no? So this same thing holds true for the other 4. Ill will, lethargy and drowsiness, agitation and worry. And the 5th one he's calling uncertainty is mostly called skeptical doubt, but uncertainty is a very good word also. It's a very clear explanation also of what goes on in the mind, an uncertain mind without direction. So a bhikkhu knows when there is a desire for sensual pleasure, and he also knows when there's no desire for sensual pleasure. Well, I think we can tell that in ourselves if we pay attention. And this is a very important aspect of our attention. Because the more we are looking for sensual pleasure, the less we're on the path. It's not that there's anything bad about this, but sensual pleasure distract us from the actual understanding that they are so fleeting and so unsatisfying that they are always just a substitute to get rid of a little bit of dukkha for a very short period of time. So it's very important to know when we are desiring sensual pleasure and also knowing that we're not desiring it. When we know that we're not desiring it, that there are certain sensual pleasures, for instance, that we may have given up already because they're no longer interesting to us, we can feel that we have progressed along a certain path already. There are certain things we might have wanted to do in past years were really important to us, and we're no longer interested. But there are other things that we're really craving to do. So we can look at that and see, is it necessary? And now there is also this mindfulness of how does this unarisen desire arise? How does the desire arise which wasn't there before? Now the obvious thing how it arises is when we have sense contact. We either see it, hear it, taste it, touch it, smell it, or think it. So the best thing to do is to do neither of those. If it arouses a desire, if the thinking about a certain thing arouses a desire, it's best not to think about it. I mean, it's very simple, very simple. Let's say you're on a fast, and you start thinking about food. What are you going to do? Go to the fridge and get some, eventually. It's best not to think about it. It's best not to smell it. It's best not to touch it. It's best not to look at it. All of those things will arouse the desire for it. A very, very simple and I think quite telling explanation how we can protect ourselves from unarisen desire. Now this is a particular situation when one is fasting, but there are other things which are we will desire because they happen to come within our sense contact and which are totally unnecessary to desire. And they only bring about two possibilities. One is unrest and lack of quiet because we want something that we haven't got, so we've got to go after it. And the second thing that it brings about is disappointment because it doesn't supply what we were looking for, complete satisfaction. And also, it keeps us within that stream of the marketplace where those desires, the gratification of those desires is possible. Whereas without that, outside of it, those ordinary desires have no meaning. They're meaningless. So he understands how there comes to be abandoning of arisen desire for sensual pleasure and how comes to be the future non-arising of abandon. What is that? The future non-arising of abandoned desire. I'm afraid I don't quite get it. What is that? He understands how there comes to be, the future non-arising of abandoned desire.
I think it's saying once the desire, when something is abandoned completely and doesn't re-arise, we've seen that it doesn't re-arise, so why?
The future non-arising of abandoned desire.
Total uprooting of that what you're going to find?
Yes.
Oh, well, why don't they say total uprooting? That would be very nice. That would be easier. Well, the first thing was that the abandoning of the arisen desire. Now, that is another thing that we have to get clear in the mind. How do we abandon it? Once the desire has arisen, how do we abandon it? And if we have abandoned it, how did we do it so we can do it again? Well, there are many factors involved. One of the factors is that the desire which has arisen even if it is gratified, will not bring satisfaction. The desire itself brings unhappiness. The desire itself is already showing that there is dissatisfaction within, otherwise there couldn't be a desire. There are many mental factors which could help us to abandon the arisen desire. It's much easier not to let the desire arise than it is to abandon the one that has already arisen. And the way to not let the desire arise is to guard the sense doors. Guarding the sense doors. We've got 6 of them. And guarding them is a way not to let the desire arise. The Buddhists called the desire for sensual gratification being in debt, because we have to keep on paying off over and over again. Because we cannot ever get the gratification for sensual desire to remain with us. It has to be gratified over and over again. And he compared it with a water pond in which many different colors are thrown so that one cannot see one's likeness. If one is overcome with desire, one can't see anymore the truth behind it. Now, desire does not necessarily have to be something great, like doesn't have to be, the strongest one is sexual, but it doesn't have to be sexual desire. It doesn't even have to be desire for fame and fortune. It doesn't have to be any of that. It can be the smallest thing, which is making us restless because we haven't got it. So if we can see the restlessness which arises from unfulfilled desire, instead of trying to fulfill it, we could try and drop it. To know the 5 hindrances by heart and check oneself against those 5 is very valid and very valuable, because they are the great disturbers. They do disturb us. And it is not always easy to know that this is what's happening, because particularly with sensual desire, it is sanctioned by society. The more desire we can gratify, the more successful we are supposed to be. Society sanctions that, and since everybody is doing it and everybody is supposedly happy with getting their sensual desires gratified, it is sometimes very difficult to see in ourselves that we are actually going a pathway towards an ultimate unhappiness. See, sensual desire does not stop with old age and even on the deathbed. And if one doesn't do something about it at the appropriate time, one is due for a very unhappy situation. Young people can gratify their sensual desires more easily. And also, they have more possibilities for that. But if one doesn't see that gratification is nothing but a very momentary affair and never satisfying, it does never bring that ultimate satisfaction within, one doesn't do anything about it. One isn't able to stop it ever. It's like paying a debt which is never paid off. I'm not going to talk about the rest of them because it's going to take too long, but I will talk about them tomorrow. However, I will say one more thing about sensual desire. It's very interesting aspect, at least I think so, that these 5 hindrances have the counteraction in the 5 factors of the first meditative absorption. The 5 hindrances all have their automatic remedy in the 5 factors of the first absorption. That remedy is, of course, only during the meditation. However, the more often one does it, the more one undercuts the strengths of those hindrances. The constant and repeated remedy will eventually make those hindrances weaker and weaker, so that one day we are able to uproot them. The uprooting comes through insight, but the weakening comes through the meditative absorptions. The sensual desire is counteracted through one-pointedness, which happens to be the 5th one of the 5 factors of the first meditative absorption. Now, one-pointedness, ekagata, means that the mind obviously has to stay in one place when there is a meditative concentration. The mind has to be one-pointed. So at that time, when the mind is one-pointed, it cannot possibly have sensual desire. In other words, it can't be looking for, isn't it time for lunch yet, or it's too cold, or it's too warm, or I'm not sitting nicely, maybe I could get another cushion. It's none of that. It's one-pointed, absorbed. And because we do it more and more often, become more and more often one-pointedly absorbed, and thereby counteract all sensual desires, we also learn through the absorptions that the results of the absorptions are far superior to any gratification of sensual desire. So not only do we get through that one-pointedness an automatic purification system, but we also have the personal experience that the gratification of sensual desire does not compare in any manner or form to that which is available through the meditative absorptions. And that very first one of the hindrances then has as its remedy the 5th one of the 5 factors. That particular factor, that 5th one, stays with us in all the absorptions. The other 4 gradually are eliminated or substituted. However, the 5th one, the one-pointedness, stays through all the absorptions, of which there are 8. So you can see that the more we do the meditative absorptions, we have a strong purification system for sensual desire. And sensual desire, of course, also includes sexual desire, and because that is a sensual desire, but it includes every wanting, everything what the mind wants to accumulate, where it thinks that outside things will enlarge happiness, no matter what it is, even small things. And because the one-pointedness is the underlying factor, not only of the first one, but of all 8, because without one-pointedness there is no absorption, we have a very strong medicine for sensual desire. Okay, any questions?
Equanimity is one-pointedness.
Yes, well, equanimity is a word that we substitute for that, but the one-pointedness has to be part of every absorption. Whereas if equanimity is the feeling which arises, the one-pointedness is the action of the mind.
What are the other four factors besides one-pointedness?
I'll get to them when I get to the hindrances. As the hindrances get each factor, I'll put the matching factor to the hindrance. Okay? Because now we've only talked about the first one. Right? And the other four I've put every matching onto it. So that you've got them together.
I was wondering, could it be said that there are two types of sensual desire? One to make the body feel good, and the other type to make the ego feel good?
Yes, you could say like that, certainly. Yes. Although I would say that when the body feels good, the ego also feels a bit better. It feels a little supported. You know, have a little hot water bottle or an extra pillow under your head or that type of thing, you know. And so the ego feels, oh yes, I'm looked after, you know.
Because we identify it.
Yes, that's right. Yes. But primarily, you're quite right. We do look for the bodily comfort, and we do look for the ego support, which does not necessarily have to include bodily comfort. So what I'm saying is that the bodily comfort will include the ego comfort, but the ego comfort does not necessarily have to include the body comfort, because you can have that ego support by just talking to somebody or, you know, having a conversation or something like that.
And those two desires are what the economy runs.
Sorry?
Those two desires are what our economy runs.
Yes, certainly. Particularly the first one. Particularly the first one, the body comfort.
But then again, as you're saying, if you talk to somebody, you feel better.
You may not. Yeah.
But then that can be reflected in the body too, because then if you're feeling better, the body can relax.
Oh yes, but you weren't looking for the body comfort.
No.
You were looking for the ego support and the ego maintenance, and that you then have the result of that you feel a little more relaxed. Yes, but in the first instance you would be looking for body comfort, you know, and in the second instance for that, the desire for the body comfort, desire for the ego support thing. They do, certainly, the body and mind, while they are two, are interdependent. There's no question about it. The mind gives the orders, and the body has to follow suit if it can. But of course, you see, if the body is feeling good and comfortable, and particularly an untrained mind, then feels all right, or vice versa. And if the mind is at ease, well, obviously the body can relax. And so the most and more important thing is, of course, the mind. But we do not have that particular ability yet, so we do react to our body. But it's right what Steve is saying, that we are looking for those two. We have those two desires, body and mind desires, both, to keep them nice and looked after. That's why we like to talk to people who are support us and are nice to us. We don't like to talk to people who tell us the truth about ourselves. Anything else about any of this? This particular sutta contains such a wealth of stuff that it's enough for a whole month, isn't it?
In Christianity, aren't sensual desires considered a sin? Evil? How does that relate?
I'm sorry, I can't answer. I don't know. I think in some manner or form, Christianity has sometimes managed to think of sexuality as sin. Original sin, that type of thing, But I think this is symbolic. I think it's been misinterpreted. I think that's a great misinterpretation, because you see, original sin in the Buddha's interpretation is avidya, which is ignorance. It's a non-knowing. And original sin doesn't have to be sexuality. It's a non-knowing that we are not what we think we are, and sexuality is a desire which springs from that non-knowing. So the whole interpretation, I think, has been too simplified, so that you can't relate to that anymore properly. The Buddha talks about sensual desire as not being a very good thing, right? But doesn't call it sin, doesn't call it original sin or any sin whatsoever. It just says, well, it's not going to satisfy you in the long run, but find out for yourself. So I don't know that I think the symbolism in Christian teaching has been mislaid somewhere along the line, and that's why we find explanations which are not satisfying very often. I think if we go deeper into it, we can find a much more satisfying understanding.
Don't both say you'll be punished.
Sorry?
Don't. Christianity and Buddhism say you'll be punished in some form for sensual desire.
Do they say that? Are you asking me? Well, no, neither one of them says that. Christianity says, as you sow, you will reap. And the Buddha says, karma has results, which is identical. You don't get punished. There's nobody there to be punished anyway. You get results. And they can be pleasant or unpleasant. So if you want to prevent unpleasant results, well, find out how you can make good karma to get good results. And that's all. So if you consider that a punishment, yes, of course, it's an interpretation. But actually what it is cause and effect. And both of them say exactly the same thing. In this particular instance, they're practically using the same language. A little more colorful, actually, in Christianity, as you saw you will read.
So talking about symbolism and it getting lost, what about the Buddhist talk of hell and the Christian talk of hell? I mean, is that a symbolism for negative mind states in your understanding?
Yes, not only in mine. There are many interpreters, Buddhadasa being one of them. I just happen to know that because I just read it today. And he's a very well-known monk in Thailand. That are interpreting the cosmology of the Buddha's teaching of the 31 realms of existence as mind states, states of consciousness. And I think that we could very well relate to that. In fact, I relate to that personally, because even as a human being, we know states of mind which are like hell. In fact, we had a visitor here 2 days ago who said, my last 2 years were like hell. Mm-hmm. Well, his mind states, obviously. He wasn't living in any particular thing that was, giving him hell. His mind states were hell. But we know other states of mind also of people who were in hell states. We know animal states, utter greed of people. We know the states of exalted states, where we have great love and compassion and no negativity at all. So I would say that we can say that there are 31, the Buddha described 31 states of existence, the lowest being hell, which are states of consciousness. But you must also remember that states of consciousness are the cause for the type of body one has. So the states of consciousness also create different kinds of bodies. In some instances, no bodies at all anymore, only mind states. So that too arises, which goes with it. So there's that too. But they are primarily states of consciousness, yes. And I dare say that one can interpret the Christian teaching in the same way. I don't know. I mean, I haven't tried to do that, but it stands to reason that would be possible also. I think I even had a conversation once. I don't know whether this can be interpreted.
So would that mean that if you lived a really kind of wretched and mean life, that your rebirth would be as a kind of wretched, miserable person next time, rather than being born in a hell realm?
Well, either. You could be born as a wretched and mean person, yes, certainly. And that would be very natural to happen. A hell realm, it could conceivably be also a different type of body, which has different experiences. I don't know. This is conjecture. It's certainly due to one's mind states. And that's why mindfulness of mind states is of the utmost importance. Mindfulness of our mind states and our mind content. The mind content is even easier, what we are talking about now. It's easier than mind state. Mind state is still more diffuse, it's more abstract. Mind content is solid. We know when we're getting angry. Who doesn't? We also know when we're loving. These are content of mind. And here we have been only talking about desire states. But desire states, if really watched desire states, you can see how much dukkha they produce. They produce nothing but dukkha. It's only when you let go that the dukkha goes. So that is very, very important for our daily life, and very important, of course, for our meditation also, because when we are distracted in meditation, it's most of the time because of desire. It's not necessarily that we want to get something to eat or anything like that. It's a desire to have the ego support. See, why is it so difficult to become concentrated? Because the ego doesn't have a support system and there's no thinking. So as soon as we drop that desire to have that, we are already a step ahead. Yeah.
So we're saying that the ideal states would be the neutral states because they produce no karma, and thereby not necessarily producing further existence.
What are neutral states?
The state where craving is ceased, it's just peace.
Oh, at that moment, not karma being produced. Well, it's like this. As long as there's no enlightenment, we're always producing karma. It may be very minor. The person, the human being who has become enlightened, has no me concept. Therefore, there's nobody there to produce karma. As long as we have a me concept, we are producing karma, even good karma. So if we have, for instance, a state of mind, which you just described as neutral, which you said would be a state without craving. Okay. We still know that this was me having that. Okay, so we're making good karma. The making of karma only stops when the maker has stopped.
Could one recognize that state?
Oh, definitely.
But how would one recognize that state if one wasn't doing it?
One wouldn't. Not now. as soon as we get finished with this Satipatthana Sutta, which we should eventually, we will have suttas that will show, and if I haven't chosen the right one, I will choose another one, which will show the steps that take you to that point, which is the path and fruit moments. The path and fruit moments. The path moment, the first one, is the first experience of nobody there. And having experienced that path moment, the fruit moment is the recognition of it, which is the understood experience. And the onus is on oneself. Okay, one can discuss it, one can find the possibility of confirmation, but the onus is on oneself. And there are certain criteria which are the same for everyone. So we'll discuss it at length outside of the Satipatthana Sutta. Okay? Right. Anything else? Yes.
About the absorption, when you get to that level, do the 5 hindrances disappear? Never to come backwards, or is one constantly shifting between?
The 5 hindrances disappear and never come back on enlightenment. They get cut down in their strength and diminished through the meditative absorption, so that their uprooting becomes easier. As long as they are full strength within one, we haven't got a chance. They are just too strong for us. So we have to work with them on 2 levels. One level is the meditative absorption, which cut down their strength. You can compare, or I usually compare that to cutting down the weeds in your garden. You don't uproot them, but you cut them down so that eventually their weeds get so puny that you can easily pull them out. The other level on which we work with the hindrances is in daily living. Having understood what there is to be done, one also does it in daily life. One doesn't let the mind run riot in those hindrances. However, the uprooting, the total uprooting of all of them, is for the Arahant. The first step, stream entry, does not even touch them yet. Greed and hate is not even touched in stream entry. And that's the first time of the experience of Nibbana. They're not touched yet. Can you imagine the greed and hate that's rampant in the world for people who haven't even heard about it? So the sooner one does something about it, the easier life becomes. They are making our lives difficult, those hindrances. And they do it with a vengeance. And very few people in the world, considering the number of people who live in the world, are even aware of that. So we have our work cut out for ourselves. Anything else? And please put the attention on the breath for just a few moments. And look into your heart and see if you can find any anger or ill will, dislike, resistance, rejection, worry, fear, anxiety. If you find any of these, or anything else that's negative,